Our first speaker, Jeff Kerr, will be speaking about the Pig War. That's the other interesting name of an early war in the Austin area. That one's the Archives War that we're particular to here. Jeff Kerr has written 3 books on Texas history. He's really becoming one of the deans of Austin historians. Austin, Texas Then and Now was a 2005 nonfiction finalist for the Violet Crown Award. The Republic of Austin was his second book, and Seat of Empire, The Embattled Birth of Austin, Texas, won the Sons of the Republic of Texas 2013 Summerfield G. Roberts Award as the year's best literary work on the Republic. He has made numerous appearances on YNN, C-SPAN, and the Travel Channel. He's currently working on 2 historical novels and on the upcoming documentary, The Last of the Moon Towers, one of our favorite things here in Austin. Please help me in welcoming Jeff Kerr to the podium.
Well, thank you, Mark. I was first of all, I'm honored to be here, and I was tickled to hear Mark tell you guys that it would be okay to geek out here with the speakers. Another way of putting that would be to hang out with the cool people. I must say it's a little bit awkward to stand here and tell you a humorous story that involves France, given what happened yesterday. And I just want to say that I'm sure that all of you agree that our hearts and prayers are with those folks. So, why do we study history? Well, one very good reason, in my opinion, is so we don't look stupid. I'm reminded of the time a few years ago that we were having dinner with my wife's aunt and uncle, and they had just gotten back from a trip to Central America. And an anonymous person who lives and sleeps with me asked them how they enjoyed their tour of the Erie Canal. So that's one reason. Another relates to a story that my niece told me a few years ago. She was in her high school English class, and the teacher was talking about the Civil War, and he concluded by saying that the southern states became angry enough that they seceded and they left the Union. And the girl behind my niece raised her hand and said, "They left the Union?" And he said, "Yes, they left the Union." And she said, "Well, like, where did they go?" So, don't be that girl. The Republic of Texas gained its independence in 1836, and one of the first items on the agenda was to gain recognition from other countries. This would give us credibility. Anybody know the first country to recognize the Republic of Texas as an independent nation? Close, the Netherlands. Nobody remembers that because that wasn't really a world power at the time. What we were really interested in, the Netherlands was nice, I mean, they make good cheese, but what we were really interested in was getting recognition from the world powers, England and France. And thus we were thrilled when France sent a guy over here in 1839 to check us out. This man's name was, if I can remember all the names, Jean-Pierre Alphonse Isidore Dubois de Saligny. He called himself Count de Saligny, and he wasn't really a count, but the people over here didn't know the difference, and they were impressed. Well, Count Saligny showed up in 1839, and he toured the eastern part of the country, which is where all the settlements were. He had arrived from New Orleans, and he went around visiting the places and meeting all the famous people, the names we know today. He met Sam Houston. He met Mirabeau Lamar, he met David Burnett, and a host of others. Now what's interesting is if you read his letters back home and his private diaries, he was much less than impressed with all of these people. Sam Houston, he thought, was somewhat incompetent and a bit of a blowhard. Mirabeau Lamar, because of the manner of speech, Mirabeau Lamar spoke very slowly and only with great effort, and Saligny thought he was somewhat dull-witted as a result. Of David Burnett, he wrote that the man was inflexible and brittle. So he had nothing kind to say about any Texas leader, but he raved about average Texans and the Texas people in his letters back home. He was massively impressed by the fact that we were raising cities overnight, that we were constructing this civilization in the wilderness, and he concluded by saying, "What chance did mere Mexicans have against such a people?" So on the strength of these letters back home, France indeed extended recognition to the Republic of Texas. Now the next order of business for France was to send a representative over here. And they planned on opening a legation I've always been confused about that term. What's the difference between a legation and an embassy? And I've looked it up. They no longer use the term. A legation is kind of a step below an embassy. If an embassy is a restaurant, a legation is like a snack bar. And the man in charge of this snack bar was going to be Count de Saligny. He was not the ambassador. They call it a charge d'affaires. I'm probably butchering that translation, but he was the boss. And he showed up in the Republic's brand new capital, Austin, Texas, in January of 1840. Austin was not only the middle of nowhere, it was on the edge of nowhere in those days. There really was nothing beyond here. In fact, that had been a huge fight just establishing the city between Sam Houston, who thought it was insanity to put a capital on the frontier, and Mirabeau Lamar, who had dreams of grandeur, and putting Austin here was key to that. So he shows up in January of 1840. Well, there really was no city here. And the only place he could find to stay was the town's biggest hotel, one of the few hotels, Richard and Mary Bullock's Hotel on the northwest corner of Pecan Street, 6th, and Congress Avenue. And he had his whole entourage with him. So I'm sure he was running up a big tab. About a month into his stay here, the Texas Congress adjourned, and there was nothing for him to do. So he packed up his things and was going to head back to Houston and cruise around, maybe go to New Orleans for a little bit. And he went to Bullock and said, "Mr. Bullock, we're ready to check out. I need my bill." Bullock hands him his bill, and Count de Saligny looks at this thing and he says, "Oh, my good man, this is price gouging. I'll tell you what, I can't pay this, but I can pay what I'm sure you'll agree is a fair price, and here's what I'll give you." And Bullock, you can imagine, was having none of it. He said, "My price is fair, and I want all of it or none of it." And Saligny threw up his hands and says, "Well, I'm sorry, I can't pay you anything then." And he left. Well, a few months later, he came back. This time he wrote of this horrendous trip he had up from Houston, and it wasn't an easy trip in those days. He actually lost a horse, drowned in the river, one of the rivers on the way up here. One of his men got so sick that he almost died. And he got to this miserable outpost on the edge of civilization once again. He obviously could not stay with Bullock. He was able to rent what he described as a miserable 3-room cabin on the corner, the southeast corner of Guadalupe and Pecan Street, 6th Street. And along with that came some adjoining property and a few outbuildings. Well, there was really nothing beyond that. There was one other house, and then beyond that was considered Indian territory. So again, he's right on the edge of civilization. He also rented an office, which was a small cabin on the east side, on East Pecan Street in the 100 block, just east of Congress Avenue. Now keep in mind that to walk from his house to the office, he was going to have to go right past Richard Bullock's hotel, and that's going to come into play later on. Well, once he settled into his new digs, the first item on his agenda was to promote passage of what came to be known as the Franco-Texian Bill. And in this bill, France would graciously agree to pay for and construct a chain of 20 forts on the Texas frontier and staff these forts in exchange for the right to bring in settlers to certain areas and in exchange for trade grants, freedom from duties and so forth. A lot of people thought this was a great deal, Sam Houston among them. He said, "Sure, let them knock themselves out. That way we don't have to build our own forts." Mirabeau Lamar, who had, as I mentioned, dreams of extending Texas, no joke, all the way to the Pacific Ocean one day, did not want a French colony planted on his frontier, so he was against it. And Lamar at the time was president. Houston had been the preceding president. Well, in order to gain support for his bill, Saligny needed two things. He needed to get it introduced into the House of Representatives, and he needed to start lobbying. And he set up this intense lobbying program. At least twice a week, he would hold these lavish dinner parties at his house on Pecan Street and Guadalupe. You could go to these dinner parties and have all sorts of fancy food, things that he had brought over from France. He had stores of wonderful cigars, pipe tobacco, wine that you couldn't get otherwise. Now, we tend to think of our early Texas leaders as these rough and tumble frontiersmen who were just as comfortable sitting on the ground and gnawing their jerky as anything else, but it really wasn't true. Most of these guys were educated. They were from fine homes back east. They were used to sleeping in beds with sheets and having servants wait on them and having nice, good food to eat. So they lapped this stuff up, and a steady stream of visitors took advantage of these invitations, including any name you can think of that was in Austin at the time. So much so that the local paper started complaining and basically accused Saligny of buying his way with Congress. Now, you read that and you think, thank goodness we no longer do that sort of thing. We've cleaned up our act, and we don't do that anymore. But in those days, it was pretty common. Well, Saligny was doing well on the lobbying front, and now he needed to get the bill into Congress. And he needed to find a compliant congressman to do so, and he found just the guy in Congressman James Mayfield. Now, what he wrote about Mayfield in his diary, if Mayfield had seen this, I'm sure he wouldn't have been so cooperative, because he basically called him an idiot. He thought Mayfield was like the worst, stupidest person you could possibly have in public office, and nevertheless he found him useful, and Mayfield agreed to introduce this legislation to Congress. And once he had done that, he finagled an invitation to Saligny to come make his case. And Saligny showed up to a session of Congress with his entourage, and he had this map. It was 6 feet square, if you can imagine, and he laid it out on a table, and it was beautifully drawn, and all the forts were color-coded, and he explained over the course of an hour or two how wonderful this was going to be for Texas. And the Texas congressmen were extremely impressed, and not long after that, they approved the Franco-Texian bill. Well, now it was going to go to the Senate. And unfortunately for Saligny, a couple things had happened while it was being debated in the House. One is that President Lamar had gotten sick, and unable to find adequate medical care in Austin, he hightailed it for the United States, probably New Orleans, to find doctors that could treat him. So the vice president, David Burnett, took over. Now you already remember what Saligny thought of Burnett, so he was less than thrilled. He didn't think Lamar was all that smart, but at least he was a man he thought he could work with. Here was David Burnett, one of the guys that he thought was not somebody he could work with, becoming the acting president. Well, before debate could even open in the Senate, Burnett, who was not a coy politician, he wore his feelings on his sleeve, he announced immediately, sure, go ahead and pass that bill because I'm going to veto it. I don't care what you guys think. It probably would have passed the Senate, but the supporters in the Senate were disheartened by what Burnett had to say about it, and they gave up the fight. They threw in the towel, they didn't even bring it up for debate, and the bill died. Now you can imagine how crushed Saligny was. Not only was he hoping to impress his superiors back in Paris, he knew that once the bill was passed, France would need a corporation that could come over here and build these forts, and Saligny knew that whoever owned that corporation stood to make a lot of money. He had just the right person in mind, a guy named Alphonse Dubois de Saligny. So he not only lost out on impressing his bosses, he lost out on making himself rich. And he was absolutely furious and livid with these stupid people that didn't see the advantages of what he had to offer. And this is where the pigs come in. I know you've been waiting. When I first heard the term the pig war, man, I was excited. I envisioned all sorts of battling pigs wearing helmets and everything else. I'm sorry to say that's not the case, but it is still a good story. In those days, people kept livestock, and most people in town had a couple of pigs that they let run around. There was all sorts of open land. Austin was more open land than anything else, and there was no point in spending good money on feeding your pigs when you could just let them wander around and feed themselves. And so everybody did that, Richard Bullock among them. Now, Bullock didn't have 1 or 2 pigs. He had to feed lots and lots of hotel guests, so he had dozens of pigs. And he let them wander around town just like everybody else. And these pigs developed an affinity for French-grown vegetables. Well, they had already broken into the French vegetable garden on multiple occasions. Some of Saligny's employees had complained to Richard Bullock. You can imagine how delighted he was to receive these complaints. I imagine him training his pigs to go down there and eat these vegetables. They didn't restrict themselves to vegetables either. On one occasion, Saligny came home, went into his bedroom. He found 3 pigs eating his bed linens and going through his diplomatic papers. On another occasion, one of his employees was out in the barn, and 3 or 4 pigs burst through a rotten wood to get at the feed trough and actually injured the man. So Saligny has had it up to here with these pigs. It reminds me of Samuel Jackson in the movie Snakes on a Plane, and I won't quote that exactly, but I think you know what I'm talking about. He had it up to here with these pigs on this farm. So, he's mad about the Franco-Texian bill. He comes home to relax, kick off some shoes, smoke a cigar, and his man comes in the room and says, "Hey, Count, the pigs were back today." And he says, "God, we're going to get those pigs. Next time they come back, we have warned this guy. Go ahead and kill him. Just kill those pigs. We'll show him." And sure enough, a few days later, the pigs were back. Saligny's men, with pistols, clubs, and pitchforks, dispatched a few of the unfortunate beasts. Well, what do you do with a bunch of pig carcasses? Fresh pig meat, right? That night, he had a dinner party planned. They served roast pork. And somebody in attendance at that party was good friends with Richard Bullock. And you can imagine him sprinting home after the dinner party, sprinting over to Bullock's place and thanking him for the wonderful meal he had just enjoyed at Bullock's expense. Well, now Bullock is really furious. And the next morning, a guy named Eugene Pluyet, who works for Saligny, paid the price of this. He had to get up that morning and walk down to the office. And I don't know what he was thinking. I'm sure he knew of this ongoing feud, but he walked straight down Pecan Street, right through the intersection of Pecan and Congress. Richard Bullock was waiting for something just like this. He came charging out of that hotel, holding his walking stick, and starts yelling at this Frenchman about his deadbeat boss. Pluyet, I imagine, is saying, "Hey, there's nothing I can do about it. It doesn't concern me." And Bullock is having none of it, and he starts beating him with this cane, enough to draw blood. Pluyet manages to get away. He runs down to the office over on the east side and bursts into the room. Well, Saligny is already there. I imagine he took a detour to get there that morning. And here comes this guy bursting into the office covered in blood. Well, now Saligny is absolutely furious. This is an insult not only to him, but to the Kingdom of France, the most powerful nation on earth, in his opinion. So he dashes off a hot letter to the Secretary of State, who would be the man to complain to. Well, the brand new Secretary of State was a guy named James Mayfield. Saligny had no choice but to deal with this guy that he thought was an absolute idiot. He went over to the office and presents him with this letter and tells him what happened, and Mayfield says, "That's a real shame. I'll tell you what, I'm going to investigate that, and if I found out anybody did anything wrong, I'll see that they get punished." And Saligny says, "Well, that's not good enough." And he says, "Look, I'm going to turn this over to the courts, and if something bad happened, they'll arrest the guy, and then your man can testify in court, and that'll be the end of it." And he says, "I can't let that happen. We're diplomats. I cannot allow, that would be a disgrace for my man to have to appear in your court of law. I'll tell you what I can do. He could write up a deposition, and we could put that into the record." And Mayfield says, "Well, that's out of my hands. That's going to be between you and the judge." So Saligny is not very happy about this. Unbeknownst to him, at the same time, Richard Bullock has written out a petition complaining about Saligny. Not only had he not paid a hotel bill, there also happened to be an ordinance in town requiring homeowners to maintain fences around their property to keep animals in and out. And Bullock claimed that Saligny had broken this ordinance, and that's the only reason that his innocent pigs had been able to get in there. Well, Mayfield filed all that away. Things just kind of simmered along for a while. And then one day, a few months later, Saligny had business to conduct with his American counterpart, a guy named Colonel Flood. And he asks his men, "Hey, where's Colonel Flood staying?" And they said, "Well, let me look. Oh, he's over at Bullock's hotel." And Saligny sucks it up and walks down to the hotel, and I imagine he's trying to sneak into Flood's room, but Richard Bullock spots him, and he demands to know what he's doing there. And Saligny says, "Look, I don't want to be here any more than you want me here. Just let me get in there, do my business, and I'll get out of here as fast as I can." Well, Bullock is having none of that. He grabs him by the collar, slams him up against the wall, starts the finger wave in the face thing, and then throws him out in the street and says if he ever comes back, he will beat him up. Well, now Saligny is just beside himself with fury. He goes back to James Mayfield and demands, a public tar and feathering for all I know, but he wanted something done right then and there. And Mayfield says, "I've already told you, this is not how we operate here. We have courts of law. This will have to also go to the court of law, and then the judge will make a determination." And Saligny, this is where he overplays his hand. He says, "That's not good enough. If you can't punish this man, who obviously is a criminal, then I am going to have to close my office until I can write to my superiors in Paris and get word back from them on what to do." Well, now Mayfield sees his golden opportunity to get rid of the whole thing. He says, you know, that's your prerogative, Count Saligny. Go ahead and close your office. I'm really sorry to see that happen. If you do that, of course, you will no longer have diplomatic immunity. And he reaches in his drawer and pulls out this letter from Bullock. And I just happen to have this criminal complaint against you with 2 charges, one of not paying a hotel bill and the other of not maintaining your property, your fences around your property. So I'm going to have to turn this over to the judge as well. By now, Mirabeau Lamar has come back into town. He gets wind of this, and he is embarrassed by the whole thing, and he does not want to see this public humiliation of the French charge d'affaires, so he asks for Saligny's recall. And Saligny leaves town in absolute, utter disgrace, never to return to the city of Austin. As he was leaving, you know, I already mentioned he did not like this little cabin he was living in, and when he had first come to Austin, he had bought 16 acres over on the east, just east of town on a small hill, and he was going to build this wonderful house that would be more fitting for a representative from the Kingdom of France, and it was almost finished by the time he left town in disgrace. So he didn't sell it right away. He let his friend, a guy named Henry Castro, the founder of Castroville, a Frenchman, he let him live in it for a while. Later on, back in New Orleans, Saligny starts getting letters from mutual friends of Castro's that Castro is throwing his own dinner parties, using up all of the food, wine, and cigars that Saligny had left behind. Not only that, he was inviting people, and this is what the letter said, with a certain antipathy towards the representative from the Kingdom of France. Now, they don't name any names, but I like to think that was Richard Bullock. Well, Richard Bullock, you'd think he had the last laugh, and he almost did. He goes down to Galveston for some business in 1842, not long after all of this, and who does he meet on the streets but James Mayfield? Mayfield must have been some kind of character, because he had not paid his hotel bill at Richard Bullock's hotel in Austin. And Bullock calls him on this and says, look, I want that money, $600 you owe me. And Mayfield is incredulous. He says, what are you talking about? I got you out of this scrape with Count Saligny. You should give me a pass on that. Well, Bullock is having none of that. They get into a fist fight on the streets of Galveston. They break that up. Bullock runs over to the hotel he knew Mayfield was staying at and demands he wants to impound the horse and carriage that Mayfield had stored at the hotel. But that hotel owner says, I'm sorry, I've already impounded that because he didn't pay my hotel bill either. So poor Richard Bullock goes back to Austin. On the way, he contracts brain fever, probably meningitis, and dies. And this was in 1842. So that's the story of the Pig War. It is indeed a funny story. It also had significant negative implications for the Republic of Texas. We did not get the $5 million loan we were trying to get from France at the time. $5 million was a ton of money back then, and Texas had absolutely no money. So it's not just a funny story. It actually had some pretty serious diplomatic consequences. All right. Well, I think we've got time for questions. We'll open it up, see if anybody has anything to say. Yeah.
How far out on the frontier were these forts going to be that the French proposed?
Well, kind of in the line of the forts that were eventually built. That string of forts that was built in the early 1850s. That you can go see the remains of some of these now. That was about where they would have been, and it was protection against the Comanche. Right? That was the big Indian power of the day, and so that was supposed to offer protection.
Please speak into the microphone. We're videotaping and recording. Change your mind now?
I have 2 questions, if I might.
Yeah.
The first is, until your talk, I always thought the pigs had gone to the French legation site, but I gather they went to Guadalupe and 6th?
Right. The French. That's exactly right. The pigs did not go to the French legation. They were going to the house at Guadalupe and 6th. He did not actually live at the French legation yet, and I don't know if there was a garden there yet or not, but where all this action was occurring was at 6th and Pecan. 6th and Guadalupe.
Right. And then the sort of a follow-up, was the French legation, given what you said about him leaving and Castro residing there, was it ever actually used as an official, site of the French government? It sounds like not.
It was not. Not long after Henry Castro had all his parties, the house was sold to a Catholic priest, whose name escapes me, who then in turn sold it to a family named Robertson, who owned it for decades, and that's the family that eventually deeded it over to become a museum in the 1920s or 30s. And before we take any more questions, I just remembered, I almost forgot, I have a few pictures to show you. How do I use this?
That should advance things. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So just, yeah, right to go forward.
So there's the pigs. This picture was done by a friend of mine, a guy who's known as the capital artist. He's worked for the teachers' retirement system for years here in Austin, and he also is a painter, and he has made numerous paintings over the years for the legislature, and he did the posters for the presidential inaugurations for both George Bush and President Obama for the Texas delegation up in Washington. And this was his drawing of the pig war. It appeared in my book, The Republic of Austin. Came out a few years ago. And there he is, the Count in all of his glory. This was his portrait that he hung when he came here to Texas to be the big shot. That does not look like a humble man to me. And you can well imagine why he let his vanity get in the way of common sense during his battle with Richard Bullock. That's Mirabeau Lamar. This is one of my absolutely favorite pictures of people from those days. It's just a crystal clear black and white photograph, and it really shows, I think, the intensity that he had. He was a self-righteous, if not an effective politician. He was, he was one of these people who did not take criticism well, and if you disagreed with him, that meant you were either corrupt or a traitor. And that's no joke. That's pretty much how he saw things, and I think that comes through in that photograph. Nevertheless, he kind of played it smart and eventually got Saligny out of town without allowing that public humiliation. This is David Burnett. Sam Houston once referred to him as that old fusspot, and I think this picture perfectly sums that up. This is the guy that Saligny described as inflexible and brittle, and boy, does he look inflexible and brittle in that photograph. 6th and Guadalupe. You're looking towards the east. It's Congress in the background there. Let's see if I can get this to work. Yeah, so this is where Saligny's house that he was renting was. And then nothing really beyond that. This is the intersection of 6th and Congress. You're looking again to the east. I was standing about the spot of the Bullock Hotel in those days, and then the office that Saligny was using was down here about where the Littlefield Mall is now. And Pluyette would have gotten beaten up right about there. This is a reverse angle of that same scene. This is where Bullock's Hotel was in those days. That's the northwest corner of 6th and Congress. This is out of order. This was supposed to be at the very end. I'm sure everybody recognizes that as the French legation today. It's a beautiful old building, and if you've never been there, I encourage a visit, and they can tell you even more about the pig war. This is one of the very first, if not the very first, image of Austin, Texas. It appeared in a book that was published in 1840, less than a year after the city was founded. You're standing about where the School for the Deaf is now and looking down towards the city. This is Congress Avenue. Here's where the present-day Capitol is. This is the river right here. Bullock's Hotel right here, plus the several buildings around it. But the main building was this white one. And, of course, Saligny's house would be off-screen to the left. This office would have been one of these things right here. And just as a side note, before all of this was here, in 1838, Mirabeau Lamar had come here running for president, scouted the area out, went on a buffalo hunt, and shot the biggest buffalo anybody had seen right there. And that is one of the reasons that Austin is where it is today. Here's the first original plat of Austin, Texas. Congress Avenue coming right down here. Pecan Street, that's the Capitol. The President's Mansion, which was really just a two-story frame house. Bullock's Hotel. Saligny's house that he was renting, and his office. And again, this is the path that Pluyette took the morning he got beaten up. Yeah?
Is that the original Capitol, the very first one?
The log, yeah, the wooden Capitol, yeah. This is the only real representation we have of what Bullock's Hotel looked like. It was made by a young woman named Julia Robertson, who was the niece of a woman named Julia Lee Sinks. Sinks, in the late 19th century, wrote a series of newspaper articles about her time living in Austin during all of this stuff. And she asked her niece to make these drawings. And what you see, this is Congress Avenue running this way. This is 6th Street. You're looking to the west. Here's that big white building we saw in the painting. And here are the rest of the buildings that went along with the whole complex. This was thought to be one of the safest places in towns in case of Indian attack, and people referred to it as Bullock's Fort. And in fact, somebody earlier mentioned the Archives War. This whole complex played an important role in that as well. Different story, but it was an important building. This painting was made by Julia Robertson. She grew up in the French legation. Her father had bought it from the priest that bought it from Saligny, and this painting dates from the 1850s. The original hangs at the French Legation Museum today. You can see it. And you can tell it really hadn't changed a whole lot.
Jeff, you had a question?
Yeah.
I'd heard that the French legation was the first plank construction in Austin, but Bullock's Hotel was it a plank construction also?
There were a few plank. The question is, was that the first plank construction in Austin, the first milled lumber? Because most of the buildings, all the government buildings pretty much were just log cabins. The exceptions being the Capitol and the President's Mansion. And they called it a mansion, but it was really just a house. So those are two that I know for sure. And Bullock's, of course, in the picture looks like it was made from milled lumber as well, or sawed lumber, rather than just logs. This would have been one of the first. I mean, they started construction on this in probably 1840 sometime. But the others were around by then.
Where's the nearest mill?
Well, I shouldn't have used the term mill, really. It was guys mostly hand-sawing lumber over towards Bastrop, yeah. Saw a hand over here, yeah.
As a result of Bullock's 1842 death, was that, did Angelina Peyton Eberly become the manager of the Bullock Hotel? Because there's that sign that says that over there at 6th Street in Congress.
Did Angelina Eberly run this hotel? That is news to me. I've not actually seen that particular sign. She did run a hotel, and she may well have taken over Bullock's because she had a place right around the corner on West Pecan that was a boarding house, and that's what she had done in other places as well. So, you know, it's not too big of a stretch of the imagination to imagine that for a time she would have run Bullock's also. Yeah.
I just had a question. You had mentioned the map that Saligny brought, the 6 foot by 6 foot map. Does that still exist? Do you know where that is? That's.
I don't know for sure, but I'm not aware of it still existing. Wouldn't that be wonderful, though? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Do you know when the east-west streets were renamed?
Where am I looking? Okay. When the east-west streets were named. The east-west streets, of course, were named after Texas trees. It's interesting that when Edwin Waller was setting up the town, he originally wanted to just use numbers. I'm not sure who vetoed him, but probably Lamar, and they named them after Texas trees, and then the north-south streets were named after Texas rivers in geographic order from east to west. The change was made sometime in the 1870s or 1880s when they went to the numbering system.
I ran into one reference that talks about Saligny when he first came to town. He didn't exactly start off on a good footing by paying the movers who moved him in with counterfeit money. Have you located that same reference?
I have not seen that. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, not that he was all that corrupt, but he certainly figured that he was above the rules, I think. What else? Yeah.
Is your book for sale here today, and where?
Well, yes. Yeah, there's a book I wrote called Seat of Empire, The Embattled Birth of Austin, Texas, that was put out by Texas Tech Press 2 years ago. And it has a whole chapter on the Pig War, and I noticed it is for sale at the Capitol gift shop table. And let me just finish by saying I would echo what was said earlier about the GLO. I've written 3 books on Austin history, and I couldn't have done it without relying heavily on the maps that I got through the General Land Office. So if you haven't done so, go to that website, look at their table today. It's really wonderful stuff, and you can buy copies of any of it. And they're great decorations, if nothing else, but they certainly help the historian quite a bit.
Thanks for the plug.
All right. Thank you.